Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We're so glad to see you all here to talk with us about risk assessments. My name is Adrienne Arnold. I'm the business manager at AEL Environment. Just before we begin, I wanted to take a minute just to recognize that the land we're on is still home to the Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and we're so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it's truly a privilege to be in a field that allows us to work to restore some of the damage that's been done to this land. Now for some housekeeping. Our presentation is about 40 minutes in length with about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end. Our presenters today are some people I have a great deal of respect for. Paul Wilson, he's our principal and senior engineer at AEL Environment. We also have Paul joined today by Lara Alves Beese and Derek Hillis, who are risk assessors with EcoMetrix. We like to say EcoMetrix are our favorite neighbors and partners. They're located just around the corner from us in Mississauga, and we're always working with them on multiple projects at a time. So happy to have you guys with us. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat bar. We'll be monitoring it throughout the presentation. We're aiming for a bit more of a conversational style, so I might be popping back in to ask questions to our presenters today as they come up. But if we don't get to your question during the presentation, we'll be including it as part of the question and answer at the end. After the webinar, you'll be prompted with a quick feedback survey. We hope that you'll fill that out. It gives us a lot of useful information about how to improve for next time. And we will be sharing an on-demand video after the session is done. So I'll now pass it off to Lara and Paul to take over.
Great, thanks, Adrienne. We appreciate everyone who's made some time to join our webinar and listen to what we have to say. Hopefully you'll find it useful and helpful as you make your decisions with respect to the properties that you're involved in or the work that you do every day. As Adrienne mentioned, I'm a principal with AEL Environment, and our particular area of expertise is doing site assessments and site remediations on contaminated properties or impacted properties, which is, of course, a more that's an area that's increasing in its usefulness for property owners as our environment becomes more urbanized. If you can go to the next slide. So our focus, as if you've joined our other webinars, is on providing practical solutions for property investment and management, and that's through the tools that we have available, both concrete tools like doing remedial works, but also some of those investigative or softer tools like our site assessment work and the risk assessment work that we get involved in with EcoMetrix. As Adrienne mentioned, EcoMetrix is certainly one of our favorite neighbors. We happen to be close to them and close to the lab, so that's great. But also, in particular, the use of risk assessment is probably, if not the most powerful tool, one of the most powerful tools that we can employ with respect to bringing back sites to beneficial reuse on the part of our owners. And so it's a privilege to be able to share this presentation with EcoMetrix. We can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, you are one of our favorite neighbors for sure. We do have a strong relationship and a long, good history. And I think what makes it works is you get EcoMetrix involved from the get-go, whether it's from your phase 1 to your phase 2. We're there from the beginning at every conversation, which we are grateful, and it has made the process smoothly and quickly. And yeah, so we really enjoy working with AEL and to find the client solutions. So just a little bit background of EcoMetrix. EcoMetrix is an employee-owned company with dedicated scientists and engineers. We strive to make our clients successful in achieving their environmental and business goals. At EcoMetrix, we leverage environmental intelligence on our clients' behalf. Environment intelligence is the product of combining our strength in science and engineering with our knowledge and technologies. Environmental intelligence represents the way we design and articulate solutions and help guide sound business decisions. Our clients rely upon our expertise to make informed decisions regarding acceptability of risk and mitigation of the potential effects of human activity on the environment. We provide a lot of services, but some of these include ecological, human health and risk assessments, environmental impact assessments, industrial hygiene, ecological services, and mining services, among others. Next slide.
Thanks, Laura. If you've joined some of our other webinars recently, you'll know that we're all about building your environmental knowledge base. So whether that's in the acquisition and ownership and disposal of property, or whether it's just managing existing problems that you may have, we're really focused on building that environmental knowledge and making sure that it's focused on the issues at hand and the solutions that are required for those issues. In particular, this session deals with risk assessment. For a number of clients, risk assessment is a bit nebulous, I guess, is perhaps a good term for it. It tends to be viewed by a lot of our clients as kind of this black box that somebody waves their magic wand over and magically my site is clean. So what we want to do in this particular seminar is to give you an idea of what that black box might look like and why it's important to get us involved early on in these conversations and these decisions, because the outcomes are very much judged by the kind of conversations that we can have at the start. So not all sites are created equal, and because of that, not all risk assessments are created equal. Every risk assessment will have a different kind of flavor, and it's our intent today to provide you with 3 different examples of what those flavors look like. They all have, I think, fairly significant differences, although that may not be apparent if you just saw the end documentation on the project. But they all end up in a place that I think makes sense for our clients and allows them to proceed with what their decisions are. If we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned before in some of our webinars, we deal with the whole property life cycle. So we're not just focused on acquisition, because many of our clients bring us in at the thinking about buying a property, or even at the other end when they're thinking of divesting a property or selling a property. But all of these decisions affect the entire life cycle of the property. So the kind of conversations that we want to have are proactive conversations with respect to planning around the site. So we want to understand what it is that you want the property for when you buy it, what you plan to do when you're using that property, and how you want to manage your potential environmental risk when you dispose of that property. So those kind of conversations, although they may seem a bit out of character for an engineering company or an environmental company to get involved in, we want to reiterate how important they are for us to make the decisions on your behalf. Excuse me, when we deal with both the risk assessment or the assessment property, and also with the interactions that we might have with the regulators on your behalf. So key to all of this, of course, is knowledge. Environmental knowledge is not just the gathering of facts, but it's also understanding of what the process looks like, and understanding about how that process interacts with the regulators when that's appropriate. If we can, and of course, the net result is we want to make better decisions. If we can go to the next slide. So we'll talk a bit about how the risk management process works. It might surprise you to see a slide that has phase 1s and phase 2s included in the risk management process, but I would like to assure you that that the people at EcoMetrix can't do their work without the phase 1 and the phase 2 information that we provide them with. And also our phase 1, in a very real sense, our phase 1 and particularly our phase 2 work is also formed by the risk assessment work that EcoMetrix does. So we are an integrated team, as you might have gathered by some of our earlier comments, but we're an integrated team, and in that integrated team that deals with risk assessment and the site assessment work, it's important that that we deal with them fairly holistically. So we're able to do that with the team at EcoMetrix. It might also surprise you that that last slide includes risk assessment and remedial options. Lots of times people think that risk assessment is this standalone thing, but it's not. It can be affected by remedial options or corrective actions that happen at the site. And we'll get into more of that later about why that's appropriate or why that's important in terms of the analysis of the risk and the use that you have on the property and why that works and what we can do about the risk. So again, all of these things are connected, just like life, I guess. So if we can go to the next slide. So what kind of questions do we ask at the beginning of a project, and why are they important? So again, we're dealing with the life cycle of a property, and we want you to consider what your end goals are. So those questions are all tied to what I call kind of the project management triumvirate of schedule, budget, and outcomes. So those three things, whether that's a triangle or three intersecting circles or whatever the visual is that you have, I think we all understand that one of these things will affect the other two. So sometimes the outcome means you can have a different outcome if you take longer and it may cost you less. Sometimes you can spend a lot of money and have a really good outcome in a very short period of time. But all of these things are connected, and whether that's in environmental site assessment or risk assessment work, or whether that's in the work that we do as on behalf of your projects, or even the projects that you do. So the questions that we ask inside of this project management triumvirate are things like, how do you buy to create value? What's important to you? Are you the kind of buyer who might be interested in a distressed piece of real estate and bringing that back to operating potential? Or are you, as a corporation or as an individual, are you super conservative and you want to make sure that you don't have anything that's going to come back and impact you later on? So how do you operate in a way that that affects those values, either reinforces them or brings them back? How do you overcome the negative things that may come along the way? And then at the end of the day, how do you dispose of this property? What's your divestiture practice? And then what kind of level of indemnification do you have? What kind of corporate protections do you need? Because different corporations have different values that go in there. So those things are important questions for us to ask that may not seem to be particularly connected to this idea of environmental risk assessment or site assessment work, but are very important in terms of the outcome. If we can go to the next slide. So again, these are just a few more, just to reinforce the point, a few more examples of what this might look like, right? So in the acquisition phase, what are the kinds of things that we do to manage risk? We do a phase one, we do a phase two, we do a risk assessment, ownership. How do you keep good records? What do those look like? What kind of orders might be applicable on site that you have to comply with? What kind of CPUs or certificate of property uses might be applicable to the site? Do you have any environmental compliance approvals that have to be adhered to? What kind of material management do you do? Because if you're going to spend all of this time and effort in acquiring a property from an environmental point of view, then the ownership should keep that good record keeping, or keep that that chain of activity going, so that when you come to divest of a property, the updating of the phase one and the phase two work is fairly straightforward and provides you with a really good solid documentation trail with respect to that property. So again, at the divestiture, that looks much like an acquisition, simply because one person's acquisition is another person's divestiture. So the package is often the same. If we can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to let Laura talk, and maybe Derek will jump in a bit too. Derek is another risk assessor at EcoMetrix, and also provides an industrial hygiene background. So I'm sure he'll have a few things to say. But Laura, if you could pick it up with respect to risk assessment and managing your outcomes.
Thank you, Paul.
I think that's where the transition is for us.
Yes, it's one outcome to manage those outcomes that we're trying to achieve through the whole life cycle process. So just to get some background on vocabulary, like what is risk assessment? What is that magic box that Paul mentioned earlier on, that you put your wand and everything's okay? So one of the objectives of the risk assessment, next slide, please, sorry. So one of the objectives of a risk assessment is to evaluate the potential risk for a contaminant to cause harm, or what we sometimes refer to as adverse effect to it, whether that be an individual, a population, or the natural environment, such as a habitat. Usually these receptors, you might hear, well, what's a receptor? I hear human, I hear ecological receptors. Those are essentially that it can be a human, it can be a non-human organism, or it can actually be a habitat, or what they call a value component. So how do we accomplish harm to a receptor? Like, how do we do that? So in risk assessment, that is accomplished by completing what we call a toxicological or hazard assessment and exposure assessment. So when these two assessments combine together, they characterize that risk to the human and non-human organisms exposed to the contaminant. Now, the exposure assessment, so like I mentioned earlier, there's two components. There's a toxicological and the exposure assessment. Now, the exposure assessment uses the concentration in the environment, such as your soil, your water, your air, your sediment, and the exposure characteristics of your human and non-human organisms. For example, let's say your site's a residential and you have a toddler or children playing in the soil, for example. So at that point, we're also describing the exposure pathways that that receptor might come into contact with. So what do I mean by an exposure pathway? Essentially, that means the physical course or route a contaminant takes from its source to the human or non-human organism. So in this drawing, which in risk assessment, you might hear it, it's called the conceptual site model. We have a couple of receptors. So let's just say we've got some animals here and we've got a human. And let's pretend that the contaminant is some soil, let's just say lead. So an exposure pathway, say, to these ecological organisms might be direct contact, which could also be the same for the individual who's playing in the dirt. If some of you have kids, you know, they like putting everything in their mouth. So if you see them, you know, outside, chances are they might accidentally be playing in the soil and they might be ingesting some soil accidentally. So that's what we're trying to do in the exposure assessment. We're trying to understand what are the receptors, who are they, what are they doing, and what are those exposure pathways. So
I'll just interject here for a second, Laura, because I like what you have to say. Intrinsically, with respect to this kind of assessment, I like to use the analogy, and Laura doesn't like this analogy, but I love this analogy. It basically says, everybody understands that you can have a bottle of aspirin and hold it in your hand. But as soon as you take that bottle of aspirin and eat the whole bottle, then of course you're into a very dangerous situation. So that's the kind of concept that we put into play using a risk assessment or using our work, where what we're trying to do is affect that exposure pathway, or deal with that exposure pathway in a similar kind of way. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's excellent. I think you hit on one of the big points there. As part of this exposure assessment, there's two types of exposure pathways, which we call complete and incomplete. So maybe keeping those aspirins in those bottles and not touching it, you know, is an incomplete exposure pathway. But once you take it into your mouth, essentially that's a complete pathway. You've now, triggered that whole process. So that's a good example, of what you're talking. And now you're saying, oh, I took 2 and I was only allowed to have 1. What does that mean? And that's where that toxicity or that hazard assessment comes into play. We are actually looking at what that exposure dose is. Like when we're talking about hazard assessment, it's really the nature of the potential adverse effect on the receptor. So that hazard can just be the contaminant itself. So it can just be that aspirin, or it can actually be what that aspirin causes. Maybe you're getting breakdown of something and it triggers something and causes toxicity to your liver. You don't know, but that's combining that exposure pathway. I know what the dose is, does it cause harm to me? And maybe it doesn't cause harm.
So how can we in a practical way, what are some examples of how we can keep the aspirin in the bottle or keep those contaminants from completing that exposure pathway? What does that look like for people?
So if we go to the next slide, that's where we're going from. So the risk assessment will say, hey, if there was no barrier, the aspirin was there, a child comes by, they're just going to eat it. They think it's candy, they're popping it in. What does that mean? So the risk assessment will go through that process and say, wow, there's a risk there. You got to control that. Like, how can you prevent that child, for example, from taking that aspirin in the future? So as a parent, you might, keep it above in the cabinet. You might lock it. You might put a barrier. So essentially, there might be a barrier that you're trying to do. So in our world, in developments, there's things like if we want to prevent soil contact, we might suggest a hard cap. So that hard cap kind of blocks that soil exposure.
So what does a hard cap look like, Laura?
So if I love these questions, Paul. So a hard cap would be, we do the risk assessment, we identify risks to a contaminant, and say on your site you have an area where there's risk to that soil. So what that means is you're probably going to need to put a cap to protect that area. So no one can go near there, or, they won't be exposed to that exposure pathway. So on sites, when we're working with our developers, they'll say, well, what implication does that have to me as in my development? Like, I'm just putting a building on site, is that good enough? Will that prevent that risk? And we work through that, yes. Or maybe they might say, but I'm not putting anything, Lara, it's just going to be parkland, but you said there's risks. What am I supposed to do? So, there might be a combination of fill cap, or there's other strategies that we might consider. Maybe that's not good enough. Saying, well, Lara, I can't do that. I can't have a hard cap. I can't have a fill cap. That's too expensive. What else can I do? And that's where we look at strategies. And I want to make sure it's clear. When I mean strategies, we might look at removing that soil, which is remediation. That's not a risk management measure. And I know in our world, there is confusion because sometimes people think that remediation is a risk management measure. It's not. A risk manager measure is usually a control, an engineering control or administrative control. It's not removing it. Risk remediation is more of a strategy. How can we reduce those concentrations? Or in other words, how can we reduce those exposure? Can we remove the soil? Or, in some cases, if it's a groundwater exposure, there might be in situ remediation. But that's what we look at. So we work with Paul and his team, and we look at the concentrations that they've identified in their phase 1, phase 2. We work with the property owner to understand their construction. What is their plan? What do they want to build? And we go back and forth, because sometimes the risk assessment might say there's risks, and we might recommend a risk management measure that's not good for the client, right? Saying, well, I can't have that. So then we look at other strategies. So it's constantly an integration back and forth. So that's why it's so important that we're integrating it right from the beginning, because our recommendations can cause a lot of headaches in the build or vice versa.
Yeah, no, that's great. But But it could be, in the projects that we've done, it could be, if you're in an industrial setting, it could be as simple as a paved parking lot, putting your building up, and some clean soil where you have some grass or landscaped area. So in those kinds of settings, we don't want to give you the impression that these are expensive, non-standardized things that have to be done, but they're often readily accommodated by your development scenario. And while we may have fancy terms for them, you know, at the end of the day, they come down to things that you know what they look like, and you know how to build them, and you know how to put them in place in the work that you do or in the properties that you take care of. Shall we go to the next slide? Is that?
Please, yes.
Who's doing this? Am I doing this or are you doing this one? I forget.
It's a combo. Go ahead, Paul.
Sure. So I think the point of this slide is to show you the kind of process the risk assessment goes through, and to build on some of those loops that that Laura talked about. So we're starting off with a risk assessment in the green triangle. Are you going to take a risk assessment approach? If your answer is yes, then obviously we do a risk assessment. If your answer is no, then you have to remediate, or maybe you have a property that's already clean, and we'll give you a real world example on a project that we worked on together in a minute that shows where that was the case. And in fact, we were able to get to the desired outcome without a risk assessment, even though we had some compounds on site that were above criteria. But if you go down the risk assessment path, then maybe in the completion of the risk assessment, like Laura mentioned, you're going to have a site remediation that's necessary. Maybe you have to take out some hotspots, or maybe there's a requirement for some clean fill at the surface, or maybe you just have to excavate for your parking lot to put down gravel, and there's some contaminated soil you have to manage. So it it could be a variety of reasons why you need some site remediation work, but that gets integrated. So then obviously you go and do that, you finish that off. Then you're asking yourself the question, do I have to adjust the exposure pathway? So this is like, how do I make sure that the aspens, if the answer to that is yes, in other words, if the risk assessment says I have to pave my parking lot, or I have to put a building in this spot, or I have to put some piping and a vapor barrier under my building, those are the kinds of things that you might be required to do. Then that adjustment to the exposure pathway is put in place, and then you get to the desired outcome. So what might the desired outcome be? In some cases, that's what's called a record of site condition, or a ministry approved risk assessment or reviewed risk assessment. In some cases, it's just a due diligence risk assessment and some controls that are put in place. Some cases it needs something registered on title as a certificate of property use. Sometimes there's instructions from the district engineer at the MOE that says you have to do this as part of your control measures. So there's a whole bunch of different outcomes, but at the end of the day, you're left with something that's manageable and something that you're able to implement as just part of your day-to-day work. And sometimes it doesn't require anything at all. We've done some developments where there is no further requirements for monitoring or action on your part. Those are rare, but they do come along every once in a while. Anything you want to add to that, Laura, or do we go to the next slide?
Next slide.
Okay. So there's just for people's clarification, we under this general banner of risk assessment, what people don't realize is that every site is risk assessed in Ontario that we go through. As soon as you go to the tables, like we talk about table 1, 2, or 3, right? Well, table 1 is background, and table 2 is non-potable, or is potable water, and table 3 is non-potable water. Well, already we know that in those generic criteria, there's risk situations that are already evaluated by the MOE, and they give you these generic numbers that have built into them this risk assessment approach. So that's important to realize, that even the generic numbers are risk-based in Ontario, and that even in the implementation of any kind of site assessment, you're comparing those generic numbers to your site, then you're doing a risk assessment. It's just the MOE has done the heavy lifting on your part. So no site is without risk, it's just managed risk. So if you're in Guelph and they use potable groundwater, you get a different number for a compound than you would in Toronto, which has non-potable groundwater. So those are the ways that it gets built into the use of the process black box of risk assessment. Can you still hear me? It's given I'm getting an internet connection problem here. So on the levels of risk assessment then that come up, we then have the ability to look at inside of this black box two scenarios. One of them is a managed approach called a modified generic risk assessment, where the MOE says you can play with these numbers, but not these numbers. Or you can do this scenario, but not this scenario. And they give you a more structured approach. It's kind of like formulas in a spreadsheet. It's a little bit more than that, of course, but that's kind of the idea. And then the tier 3 says, we will allow you to open up the whole risk scenario. So of course, as you move from left to right, from generic to tier 3, you increase your options, but you also generally increase your cost and increase your timeline to complete a project. So that's kind of that background in a general sense about risk assessments. Anything you want to add there?
No,
We're good.
Excellent, Paul.
Let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to take a look at 3 case studies. The first one is, interestingly enough, titled "Avoiding a Risk Assessment" in a risk assessment presentation. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, but I think you'll see in a minute why that's appropriate. If we can go to the next slide. So this site is a former quarry operation that is being converted to residential development. In that redevelopment application, of course, if you're familiar with the legislation, you're required to get a record of site condition, and the record of site condition requires that you do a phase 1 and a phase 2 and file a record of site condition. In the completion of that phase 2 or phase 1 and phase 2 work, we found certain compounds in the soil and in the groundwater that exceeded the appropriate, in this case, table 2 criteria, or even some of the more sensitive tables. We can go to the next slide. So in the completion of that, you can see that we've given you kind of this segmentation in the graphic on the right-hand side of the site. Has now been split into 2 parcels. So in one of these parcels, which is close to that little pond, we didn't have any exceedances, but because it was close to a pond, it was subject to a more sensitive risk scenario. So we said, we're going to treat this as a separate area. And because we could treat it as a separate area, we're able to do a risk assessment to generic criteria in this area. And then the second area, which had the exceedances, it was far enough away from the pond that we didn't have to worry about the sensitive feature, but it did still have compounds that were above criteria. So in discussions with EcoMetrix, and particularly Lara and her team, in those discussions, we came to the conclusion that these were background materials or was already designated for the site in order to correct the grade. So we undertook the site assessment with that new information and were able to eliminate areas of potential environmental concern because they were being categorized as background. So even though you have to identify it in your application to the MOE, you have to say that this is a compound that's above criteria, its background, and therefore because it's a background, or it's a naturally occurring compound that's in the background, you can eliminate it from further inquiries, and because you can eliminate it from further inquiries, you can eliminate it from your risk assessment work. So that's the strategy that we employed here. But again, just to re-emphasize, we didn't arrive at that conclusion right away. We had to have a lot of conversations with the team at EcoMetrix. We had conversations with the MOE in order to come up with that conclusion. And at the end of the day, it was actually the MOE who suggested that maybe we could employ that kind of an approach. And I add that comment because often we have this fear of talking to the regulator and bringing them into the conversation. And I have been convinced, mostly by the people at EcoMetrix and Laura in particular, that that in these kind of projects, that regulator in the conversation at an appropriate time, so that you can get the benefit of their perspective and what they'd like to see out of it. So we have, through conversation with the regulator, been able to employ, I think, some results that are more beneficial for our clients than we would have otherwise, and this is certainly one of them. I want to go to the next one, next slide. So this slide, we actually, or in this case study, we actually had to do a risk assessment, a tier 2 risk assessment, or a modified generic risk assessment, if you're familiar with that term. This was a conversion of a, sorry, if we can go to the next slide. This was a conversion of an automotive repair center or a tire center to multi-residential, a low-rise apartment building. And in this one, Sharon is telling me my internet connection is breaking up, and hopefully you can hear me. With respect to the risk assessment work that we did there, we found some contaminants in groundwater, particularly some VOCs, and some other contaminants that we were able to do some remediation by excavation. But I'll let Laura talk about how we employed a tier 3 risk assessment at this site. Or sorry, a tier 2 risk assessment at this site instead of a tier 3 risk assessment, which was normally triggered by VOCs. So I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned early, we do encourage to get involved early on in the process with the ministry. So for tier 2s, it is customary to have a pre-consultation with the ministry before submitting the MGRA, but mostly the local district engineer. So that's what we did. So from the get-go, we got involved with the ministry. We provided what our approach was, etc. And we didn't have any soil contaminants on site because we did remediate that, but we did have some VOCs in groundwater. So the groundwater VOCs were actually right in the center of the property. There was some really good delineation. We clearly characterized the plume. Everything looked good. You know, the conditions for the tier 2 worked well, etc. So there was a concern from the district engineer whether monitoring was needed. And if any of you are familiar with the regulation, in a tier 2 process, if monitoring is considered, it kicks you out to a tier 3 risk assessment. And we really wanted to avoid that because the client really needed this development to go through by a certain milestone. So by working with the ministry, we looked at strategies. And one of the concerns was more to looking at offsite monitoring. So risk assessments are done under the regulation just to focus on on-site risks, whereas offsite assessments are more of an interpretation, so we don't do risk assessment. So there was a strategy where with the district engineer, in order to keep it in a tier 2, we had to do some offsite monitoring. And they were grateful, well, we are grateful that they decided to do that as a separate order. So that's what happened in this case. We got the RA approved under a tier 2, but we also got an order to do offsite monitoring, which was under their direction. So the district office is allowed to do that. So we managed to keep the client happy. They got what they needed real quickly. There was no penalties for them because there were some financial penalties at stake here. And it was a really, really, really good relationship. So the benefit there is the ministry understands, they know what, the client is going through. They were finding strategies that were still within the reg, that still met the act, but, also helping the client get through this process and making sure there were safe risk management measures in place, and that offsite receptors were also being protected through a separate monitoring plan. So I just want to, I can't say it enough, get the ministry early on and often. And maybe, we're all scared, like Paul says, but you know what? The ministry is going to see it eventually. Why not give them heads up early so that they can provide, they won't give you, the ministry will not recommend what you need to do, but they will give you things to think about. And I think that thinking about really does help in the process. So I guess next slide. Paul, or do you have anything to add to that?
No, sorry, I just jumped out to fix my internet connection. Hopefully I'm a little better than.
So yeah, so I just recapping what I said. We tried to avoid on-site monitoring. Well, we didn't try to avoid, we demonstrated actually that on-site monitoring was not required, but because there was uncertainty with off-site implications, which Tier 2 does not address, we worked with the district engineer to find strategies on how we can, make sure those off-site concerns are addressed. And that led to a monitoring program for off-site. And, it was a very, very tight budget. We had to get this risk assessment done in less than a year, and we managed to do it by keeping it in a Tier 2, which is great.
And I think that's really the takeaway, is that you have you've taken what is probably should have been at least a 2-year process. You've cut that in half, and you've engaged in a more predictable outcome at the end of the day. So this really benefited, if you think of that project management triumvirate. We brought it in at a less expensive option, although it was still fairly costly. We brought it in at a less expensive option. We brought it in faster, and the outcome was protective of human health and the environment, as it would be a requirement anywhere, and as vouched for by the MOE in the issuance of the record of site condition. So all of those things were met, and we were able to see that by taking a different kind of an approach. So, next slide. Go ahead, Laura. We're in tier three strategy.
So next slide, please. So Paul, actually, did you want to give a little? Okay.
Sure.
The background on
it? I can do that. This is again an industrial site. Well, actually, it was a fill site. There had been a historic valley that was historically filled in a long time ago, and it was filled in with contaminated fill. So they wanted to build a townhome development on it, and that required that we bring a risk-based strategy because of the nearby residential and the depth of the fill. It wasn't possible to excavate it all, as well as the cost associated with that. But we did remove some soil, but not all soil, and then brought in both a risk assessment approach, but also used what's called a stratified approach to leave some contaminants above the risk-based levels at depth. So maybe you can talk about that a bit more too then, Laura.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So in the risk assessment process, or in general, there's two assessment approach, or what they call restoration approaches. So there's the background, there's the full generic, and then there's the stratified approach. What's really common is the full depth approach. You see those risk assessments in Tier 3. That's probably one of the most common. And then the next common is probably a Table 1, or what we say an environmental site assessment. But sometimes you don't see too many stratified approaches coming into a Tier 3 RA. And that can be for many reasons. For example, you might have a site where you need to convey land to the city. And when you look at the city's policy for accepting those conveying lands, or in some cities they call dedication lands, they won't accept a restoration that's based on a stratified approach. So that can make it difficult. But in this case, for this site, there were stability issues. We had to use a stratified approach. We could not go to a full depth. It just would not work. So that's what we did. We did a stratified approach, and the outcome of this is we did have to, there is a CPU that went into here, with one of the restrictions being that you can't remove the sub or surface soil. So when I mean surface soil, that's soil that's less than 1.5 meters below ground grade, and then subsurface is greater than 1.5 meters below ground, surface ground. So that was one of the conditions on the CPU. Now that you have this, you can't remove the surface soil. And the reason for that is that surface soil is kind of acting like a cap almost. So that was one of the implications on that. And also one of the implications is you cannot remove that soil that is below that 1.5 meters. So in the end, you know, townhomes got built, they were stable, and we were able to find a solution, because I believe, Paul, correct me, I think the solution was really to dig it all out, and that we couldn't do that. So risk assessment came to play on this side because it just wasn't feasible to do that.
Yeah, I think risk assessment was always planned.
It always is, yes.
As part of this. But in particular, we did end up with a fairly significant excavation, partly because of you know, site grading and excavation requirements to begin with. There was surplus soil, but also because the risk at the end, one of the goals is to come up with property specific standards, of course, right? So just like you have generic standards, the risk assessment provides you with property specific standards. So in this case, those property specific standards for the near surface soils are actually exceeded at depth on this site. And that's why we call it a stratified approach, is because we have higher concentrations than would be allowable under the property specific standards. So in those cases where those property specific standards were higher in the near surface soils, that required some excavation work as well. So again, we're working in tandem, or we're worked in tandem on this particular site, marrying the need for remediation with the need for risk assessment and property specific standards, and accomplishing the desired outcome here. So.
Paul, I just want to comment on that. So when we do derive for this site, when we did derive the property specific standards, there's two. So what you see is you'll have one for the subsurface and then one for the soil. So there's two. Whereas in a typical like full depth, you're only going to see one set of property site specific or property specific standards. So that's important to distinguish. So.
Yep. Yeah, no, for sure. So if we can go to the next slide, we'd like to leave you with at the end of this part of the presentation. We'll open it up for some questions, but leave you with some takeaway messages if you can advance. So, so I think just to reiterate Laura's mantra, and our mantra is to engage with people like EcoMetrix early on in the process, so that we talk together, get the right decision makers to the table, bring in the MOE and the district engineer in particular. They're usually the ones that are the most helpful in this process. And then ensure that you have adequate delineation prior to submitting the paperwork, the risk assessment paperwork to the MOE. That makes their job easier, so they're not commenting on both the delineation requirements and the risk assessment requirements. And then if a remediation and risk assessment approach is planned, ensure that that you do that work before you put in the pre-submission form, so it's not unnecessarily complicated. So if you think about going back to that first site, we did a whole bunch of work with the quarry operations. We did a whole bunch of work beforehand to make sure that when we submitted it, it reflected the property the way it was being perceived at the point of development, and not complicated by all of the earlier information. Although that was there, it reflected the current condition at the site. So that was helpful. Anything you want to add there? Let's go to the next slide. Again, this is a theme that we put in some of our other webinars. Please don't walk away from a site because you think it's too hard to deal with, unless it's because you know, you just think it's going to take too long, or you don't have enough patience, or you have another deal that's better, or but don't walk away from it because you think that the environmental is too hard to deal with. There's almost no site that we can't approach through this combined effort of site assessment, site remediation, and risk assessment, and bring it back to beneficial reuse and restore it. And I can't overestimate or overstate our commitment to that kind of a goal. Urban properties have a lot of benefits going for them, and left in a derelict state, a lot of negative impacts on our neighborhoods. So the more we can restore those to beneficial reuse, the better off we are. But it does mean that you need quality information and advice that can pay off. It does mean you need some patience, and it does mean you need realistic solutions and practical solutions, and we bring those to the table. But that creative problem solving can pay off and create some value in a property that might not be there readily apparent otherwise. And don't be afraid to be informed. Have lots of conversations and know that the risks on a particular property can be managed. And I think it's time for questions now. Next slide. Yeah. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. On the Tier 2 risk assessment study, can you further elaborate on why offsite monitoring was accepted by the ministry? What on-site conditions, if present, would cause the ministry to not accept offsite monitoring? And do you need to monitor offsite at all property boundaries, as this can produce challenges as well?
You want to take that one, Laura?
Sure. So let's start with the first question, why an offsite monitoring was accepted by the ministry. So in this case, I can't speak on behalf of the ministry why they accepted it, but we were able to show that for our site, the VOCs weren't exceeding offsite. We also had some soil vapor probes installed at that site in order to support that situation, but just to get some more seasonal and long-term confidence, the ministry wanted to get some more of those readings offsite, and they wanted to make sure that, you know, we really did capture the groundwater plume, that it wasn't moving offsite. So we actually had to do a little bit of work offsite. We actually worked with the neighbor who allowed us to come on site to drill some monitoring wells and also to put in some soil vapor probes. So they were very helpful, and we were able to show that, yes, the groundwater in that area is clean, and the soil vapors were okay. So that's how we got around that. And I think the ministry needed to see the lines of evidence, and just to put those lines of evidence, they wanted another monitoring program. So it's all about demonstrating, putting the evidence on the table and showing why it's scientifically feasible. So that's why I think the ministry accepted it. But like I said, I can't talk on behalf of the ministry. So the next question is, what on-site conditions, if present, would cause the ministry to not? Okay, so that would be the opposite. So if we were to show on our off-site, yes, we have vinyl chloride off-site, moving off-site. If we showed that the soil vapor that we collected was exceeding health-based criteria, it would stop. we probably would have been actually into a tier 3, we probably would have been triggered. So it's showing that evidence. So yeah, so if you're showing it's moving off-site, you're not getting the data, then they probably would not have accepted that off-site monitoring. And well, they wouldn't, but you would have to put a barrier or something on site, another risk management measure in order to avoid contamination moving off-site. So I hope that's answering those 2 questions. And the other one is, did you need to monitor off-site at all property boundaries, as this can produce challenges as well? We only had to monitor where our most sensitive receptor was. Basically, we had to monitor where groundwater flow was moving. We had groundwater flow well characterized over season and time and spatially. So that's where we focused on, because we knew that's where the groundwater was moving. So that's where we focused the monitoring. We did not have to look at all the properties. I guess every property is unique. There are properties where you get a radial where groundwater can flow anyway, depending on season. But in this case, we were fortunate that, you know, groundwater was always going the same way through all different seasons. So.
What,
Awesome.
another question?
Yeah. So it's about the tier 3 case study. How long did this take to complete, and what factors that caused the RSC to be accepted by the ministry? And what they mean is, what are the factors that cause an RSC to take longer to be accepted by the ministry?
Sure, I can talk to that a bit, and you can probably jump in a bit. That's probably that's probably the #1 question that we get asked by our clients, is how long is this going to take? And close behind that is, how much is this going to cost? So we're used to answering those questions a lot, and unfortunately, the answer is generally it depends. But I can give you some factors that come into play. If you're into a risk assessment, so first of all, let's say you're starting with this property from you don't have a site assessment or any kind of work. So the site assessment work probably will take you something in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 months to complete the site assessment work. You might get it done a little bit quicker. It might take you a little bit longer, depending on the results of the work. And then with respect to the risk assessment, then you're probably into submitting either a pre-submission form or a draft of that risk assessment if it's an MGRA. MGRAs take 4 months to review. Is that,
So yeah, it's 8 weeks.
Yeah, it's 8 weeks. Thanks.
Yeah.
It's 2 months. And then tier 3 risk assessments take 16 weeks, right?
Yeah, 16 weeks. And then there's this other type of risk assessment called a wider abatement, which is 22 weeks.
So just the review time is going to take you somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 months just for the MOE to review the documentation. Then they come back. They generally have some comments, just like you would have in a planning application or something like that. They'll have some comments that come back. You have to address those comments, and then you're into another period of review. We're generally hopeful that we address them all in one round of comments, as opposed to additional rounds. But each round requires a review period, and that review period, the statutory review period, is as Laura stated, and you end up being between something in the neighborhood of 2, 4 or longer in terms of that review period for months. So our rule of thumb is that on a site that you're just starting out with, that you will probably not see an approved risk assessment on that property. If you can do it in less than a year, you're doing extremely well. If you can do it in a year and a half, you're probably doing better. But you're into something that's more than 2 years. I'm also cognizant of the fact that we're at 1 o'clock now, and we do like to end on time. So hopefully we've provided you with some some input that's helpful, and hopefully you will be able to get some more information. As always, we're open to questions. We'll try and address the questions that are left over with the group offline, but strategies, and that's coming up at the end of March.
Just in case that you missed that with Paul's internet cutting out there, we just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we have another webinar happening March 31st. It'll be with Isotech, who is a remediation partner that we work with. So we hope that we will see you there. And we thank Laura and Derek so much for attending and being part of this. And thank you to everybody for joining as well.
Thanks.